The millionaire invites his beautiful maid to accompany him to a luxurious ball. To his surprise, she accepts, but he didn't know that, on that grand night, he would end up falling in love with her. Ethan Whitmore's mornings began the same way every day. At precisely 6 o'clock, the blinds in his Manhattan penthouse rose with a soft mechanical hum, revealing the distant shimmer of the Hudson River. He sat up in bed, swung his legs over the edge, and stepped onto the heated floor, with the kind of precision that came not from discipline alone, but from years of conditioning. His world was measured in contracts and coffee spoons, in silent elevators and driver schedules. Ethan was a man of order, and order was his refuge. By the time he arrived at his office in Midtown, his personal assistant had already reviewed his calendar, filtered his emails, and placed his first coffee of the day, a dark roast with a single cube of raw sugar, on his desk. He signed deals worth millions with the same calm he used to approve his lunch orders. At 38 years old, Ethan Whitmore was not only one of the city's most respected real estate moguls, but also one of its most elusive bachelors. Charm was expected, presence was required, but affection, that had been filed away a long time ago, somewhere between a divorce that ended too quickly and a series of socialite flings that ended too quietly. The silence of his personal life suited him until Emily Carter stepped into it. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, punctual and polite, hired through a private agency that vetted all domestic staff with obsessive scrutiny. Emily was described as professional, discreet, and reliable. Ethan barely looked at her the first day. She wore a simple uniform, her hair tied back neatly, and spoke only when necessary. Her presence was designed to be invisible, but to Ethan's surprise, it wasn't. Over the weeks that followed, he began to notice things. The way she moved efficiently but with a kind of quiet grace. The way she folded the newspaper as if it were still something sacred. How she never hummed, never checked her phone, and always seemed to carry herself with a subtle weight in her gaze, as if the world she walked through demanded more effort than it should. Ethan found himself observing her more closely, not out of attraction at first, but out of curiosity. She was unlike anyone in his orbit. She didn't dress in designer brands or speak in rehearsed charm. She didn't ask questions. She didn't smile for effect, but she had a stillness to her, a quiet resolve that somehow made the air around her feel more honest. It was during one of his rare free afternoons, sitting in his expansive living room with the glass wall behind him, revealing the city skyline, that he realized Emily was quietly replacing a vase on a side table. It wasn't out of place, and yet she adjusted it slightly, as if the symmetry of the room depended on it. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw a woman in her late 20s perhaps, with auburn hair pulled into a practical knot, and a softness in her features that belied a certain emotional armor. "Do you like working here?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the kind of silence most employers maintain with their staff. Emily paused, straightened up, and glanced at him, not nervously, but cautiously. "It's a good job," she replied simply. "Only good?" he probed, not knowing why. "I've had worse," she said, then excused herself before the conversation could deepen. Later that evening, Ethan found himself thinking about that brief exchange, not the words, but the tone. There was no self-pity in it, just truth. It stirred something dormant in him, not pity, but a kind of alertness he couldn't quite define. Days passed. Conversations remained brief, but Ethan's awareness of her presence grew. He noticed that she always left the kitchen spotless, that she favored chamomile tea, that she lingered for a second too long at the bookshelf in the study, and he began to wonder about the person behind the role. He asked his assistant discreetly what she knew about Emily. The agency had confirmed no red flags, a background of steady if modest employment, no complaints, no drama, a younger sister she supported, a mother who had passed away. That was all. That night, as he sat by the window sipping his scotch, Ethan thought about contrast, not in architecture, not in color theory, but in lives. His polished and secure, but empty in ways he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Hers perhaps heavy with unspoken stories, but anchored by something far more substantial than wealth. He didn't know it then, But the gap between their worlds was about to be challenged, and for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore felt the faintest spark of unpredictability. It had been a long Thursday, the kind that left the air in Ethan Whitmore's penthouse thick with stillness. The city roared below, muffled by the thick, double-glazed windows, but inside everything remained poised and untouched, as though time bowed to the man who lived there. Ethan stood by the wet bar, pouring himself a glass of bourbon, more out of habit than desire. It had been a day full of negotiations, meetings stacked like bricks, and yet, as the amber liquid swirled in his glass, his mind wasn't on real estate or markets. It was on her. Emily Carter moved silently in the adjacent room, organizing the silverware drawer. She always worked this way, with purpose and precision, but never with haste. There was something about the way she completed even the most mundane tasks that held a quiet dignity. Ethan watched her, not like a man watching, a woman he desired, but like someone studying an enigma he had never taken the time to understand. The invitation had arrived that morning, an embossed envelope with gold lettering, sealed with the insignia of the St. Regis Foundation. The annual Winter Gala, a spectacle of opulence disguised as philanthropy. Ethan attended every year, mostly to maintain appearances, rubbing shoulders with investors, donors, and socialites whose smiles were as rehearsed as their laughter. It was expected of him, as was bringing a date, preferably someone equally elegant, equally detached. Usually a model or a publicist filled that role, someone beautiful, practiced, and forgettable. But this year, something shifted. The thought had crept into his mind while Emily was dusting the bookshelves in his study. She was reaching for a top shelf, standing on her toes, focused, unaware of his gaze. In that moment, the absurd idea floated up like mist. What if she went with me? He hadn't meant to say it aloud. It escaped him, a thought barely formed. "You ever been to a formal event?" he asked, catching her attention as she stepped down. Emily turned slightly, brow furrowing in quiet confusion. "A formal event?" "Yes," he said, suddenly committed to the idea. "A gala, like a charity ball." Her hands paused, resting gently on the edge of the bookshelf. "No, I haven't." The room felt stiller than usual. The silence weighted with something unfamiliar. Ethan cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact. "I have one coming up this weekend. Black tie, very formal. Normally I go with someone for appearance's sake." He paused. "I was wondering if you'd want to come with me." Emily blinked slowly, as though recalibrating her reality. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The clock on the wall ticked once, sharply. "You want me to go with you?" she repeated, not as a question, but as a statement. Ethan nodded, forcing a nonchalance he didn't feel. "Yes, just as company. Nothing else. I thought, maybe you'd like to see that world, for one night." She looked away, her eyes dropping to the floor, then lifted again to meet his. There was no obvious emotion. No shock, no delight, no indignation. Just that same guarded calm he was beginning to recognize as her default armor. "I suppose I could," she said finally. Her voice was soft, but the effect was immediate. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a tether unhooking from where it had been anchored. "I'll arrange everything," he said. "You won't have to worry about a thing." "I'll take care of myself," she answered, her voice firm. "But thank you." And then she turned, gently sliding the last book into place, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, swirling the bourbon in his glass, watching the reflection of the city lights on the liquid's surface. He wasn't entirely sure what had just happened. All he knew was that it had been real, unrehearsed, uncalculated. That night, alone in her small apartment in Brooklyn, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone screen. Her sister Claire had texted twice, asking if she was coming over for dinner that weekend. Emily had yet to respond. Her mind was too full. She thought about the way Ethan had asked, not with arrogance or entitlement, but with an odd kind of vulnerability. Like someone who wasn't used to extending invitations without a script, she wasn't naive. She understood the implications, understood the eyes that would follow her into that ballroom. She also understood what it might cost her dignity if she played the role too well, or not well enough. And yet beneath all the noise in her head there was a small voice that whispered, "You want this. Not for the dress or the chandeliers or the music, but for the disruption, the shift, for the rare chance to step into a world that had never invited her, not out of merit or necessity, but out of choice." At the same time, Ethan was standing in his walk-in closet, absent-mindedly flipping through his collection of tuxedos. He wasn't thinking about what he would wear. He was wondering why he had asked her. Not out of pity, he rejected that notion immediately. It wasn't even desire, not in the conventional sense. It was something more complex, more honest. He was curious, drawn, and for the first time in years, he was willing to explore that curiosity without a guarantee of control. The following day, the household routine resumed. Emily continued her tasks with the same quiet precision. Ethan left for meetings, made decisions, approved designs, but something subtle had shifted between them. A glance that lingered half a second longer, a silence that felt like it carried meaning. Neither spoke of the invitation again, but both carried it with them, like a secret folded between the pages of an old book. As the weekend approached, the city braced itself for the winter gala, and inside the penthouse on the Upper East Side, two people from vastly different worlds prepared for an evening that would set in motion a story neither of them could have predicted. They didn't know it yet, but nothing after that night would ever be quite the same. By Friday morning, the unease had started to settle in. It began subtly, an extra second of hesitation as Ethan buttoned his shirt, a distant look in his eyes, during the morning call with the European investors. His decisions were still swift, his tone still precise, but something had begun to interfere with the machine-like rhythm of his days. As he read through financial reports, his mind drifted back to the brief exchange he'd had with Emily. The way she had accepted his invitation with neither flattery nor discomfort still echoed in his memory. It should have reassured him. Instead, it left him questioning why he had asked her at all. Ethan was not a man accustomed to uncertainty. His life was a network of calculated moves, perfectly timed transactions, and careful public image management. Every partnership, whether professional or personal, had always served a purpose. Emily Carter, however, served none. She was not someone who would impress potential investors or land his photo on a lifestyle magazine's next cover. Her presence at the gala could not be leveraged. It was, quite plainly, a decision that had no strategic benefit. That, in itself, was disorienting. He stood by the window of his office, looking out over Fifth Avenue, his hands deep in his pockets. From that height, people looked like ants, and he had long grown used to seeing the world that way. Distant, predictable, controllable. Yet now the idea of walking into that ballroom with Emily on his arm made the city feel far more alive and far less predictable. He wondered how others would react. He wondered what they would say behind their smiles. By midday, the first wave of judgment arrived, not in whispers but in amused sarcasm. His old friend and frequent business partner, Derek Calloway, called him after hearing rumors that Ethan wouldn't be bringing a model or actress to the gala this year. "So I hear you're shaking things up," Derek said, his voice as slick as his tailored suits. "A little social experiment, huh?" Ethan narrowed his eyes, barely suppressing his irritation. "What are you talking about? Word gets around, Whitmore, you're bringing your housekeeper to the gala. Or is she a chef, a yoga instructor? I forget how many hats your staff wears." "I invited Emily," Ethan said flatly. "She accepted." There was a pause, just long enough for Derek to register that the tone had shifted. "Well," he said, laughing lightly, "you always had a flair for the unexpected. Just be prepared. You know how these people are. They eat drama for breakfast." Ethan ended the call with a tight jaw and a lingering sense of doubt. Derek's words, though cloaked in mockery, rang with truth. Their circle was not known for tolerance, much less empathy. He could already imagine the smiles hiding disapproval, the comments disguised as compliments. And worse, he realized he had not yet asked himself the most important question: Was Emily ready for that kind of scrutiny? He imagined her arriving at the venue, walking through a sea of tailored gowns and jeweled smiles, every eye on her, not because she was stunning, though she was, but because she didn't belong. Or rather, because the crowd would believe she didn't. The thought made his stomach tighten. But even as his own doubts mounted, a quieter conflict unfolded in Emily's world. Back in Brooklyn, Emily sat at the small dining table in the apartment she shared with her younger sister, Claire. The two of them were close, their bond forged not only by blood, but by shared struggle and years of navigating life without the safety net that others took for granted. Claire, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, worked part-time at a community center while finishing her degree. She was the only person Emily trusted enough to tell about the gala invitation. When she finally did, the reaction was immediate. "Are you serious?" Claire asked, eyes wide as she dropped her fork. "You're going with Ethan Whitmore to that gala?" "I said yes," Emily replied calmly, though her fingers tightened slightly around her glass of water. Claire leaned forward, disbelief mixing with excitement. "You're going to walk into a room full of people who probably think you're the coat check girl. Emily, this is huge, but are you sure you're okay with that?" Emily didn't answer right away. She had been thinking about it non-stop, what she would wear, how she would walk, what she might say if someone cornered her with a thinly veiled insult. She was preparing herself for the discomfort, but not for the fear that accompanied it. It wasn't fear of embarrassment. It was the fear of being exposed, of walking into a place that was not built for her and having to pretend it didn't matter. "I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not," she said finally. "Then don't," Claire said, gentler now. "Just remember who you are." Emily nodded, but her heart was uneasy. She had worked so hard to build a life with integrity, one that didn't rely on the approval of people like those who would be attending that gala. And yet here she was, choosing to walk into their world, wearing their clothes, following their rules. She wondered why she had said yes. Was it curiosity, a desire to challenge herself, or something deeper, a quiet yearning for a moment that wasn't defined by survival? She remembered the way Ethan had looked at her when he asked, not with pity but with something close to respect. It mattered. She hadn't felt that in a long time. As Saturday approached, both Emily and Ethan found themselves surrounded by questions. Not just from others, but from within. What did this night mean? What doors was it opening, and which ones might it close? Neither of them had the answers, but both understood, in their own way, that the decision to walk into that ballroom together would be more than just an evening event. It would be a step into something unknown, and neither of them could afford to pretend otherwise. Saturday dawned with the pale hush of winter light spilling through the windows of Ethan's penthouse. The skyline beyond was dusted with snow, soft and serene, but inside the apartment there was a quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air. The day of the gala had arrived. Ethan, though impeccably dressed in his usual tailored leisure wear, felt the unfamiliar weight of anticipation pressing into his shoulders. He moved through the morning with practiced ease, his breakfast routine, a quick call with his assistant to confirm the driver, a final review of the gala's guest list. But beneath the smooth surface, a restless current ran through him. In a small apartment in Brooklyn, Emily stood in front of a mirror wearing a simple ivory slip and a look of apprehension that no reflection could soothe. The night before, she and Claire had stayed up late, sifting through clothing rental sites and second-hand boutiques online, searching for something affordable that didn't scream charity. By morning, a modest package had arrived. Inside, a dress the color of deep midnight, with long sleeves and a subtle shimmer that caught the light like stars on water. It wasn't extravagant, but it was elegant, understated, and exactly what Emily needed. Claire watched her from the bed, her chin resting on her knees. "You look beautiful," she said quietly, meaning it. Emily ran her fingers down the dress's fabric, feeling the delicate stitching, the faint tremble in her own hands. "It doesn't feel real." "That's because it's not," Claire said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "It's a night. One night. You go, you hold your head high, and then you come home to the life you built. You don't need to impress anyone." Emily nodded, absorbing the words like armor. She had already made peace with the eyes that would study her, the judgments that would come wrapped in politeness. But still, somewhere beneath her calm, there was a flicker of something else, something dangerously close to hope. Back on the Upper East Side, Ethan stood at a jewelry boutique on Madison Avenue. He had told himself he was only looking for a small gesture, something simple, nothing flashy. But as he surveyed the options, he realized how difficult it was to find something that carried meaning without suggesting expectation. Eventually, he selected a delicate silver bracelet with a single sapphire set at the center. It was elegant but restrained, and he imagined it would suit her perfectly. Returning home, he placed the box carefully on the coffee table and waited. Emily was set to arrive by 5 o'clock, giving them enough time to prepare without rush. He poured himself a glass of still water and sat on the edge of the sofa, his posture too stiff, his expression unreadable. When the elevator finally chimed, he stood up too quickly, brushing his hands down the front of his shirt. The doors opened, and Emily stepped out. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. She wore the midnight blue dress with a quiet confidence that made it seem far more luxurious than it was. Her hair was pinned up loosely, a few soft strands framing her face. There was no dramatic transformation, no fairy tale reveal. She simply looked like herself, seen fully for the first time. "You look," Ethan started, then stopped himself. The usual compliments felt hollow. "You look remarkable," he said instead. Emily smiled faintly, her eyes steady. "Thank you," he gestured to the box on the table. "I thought you might like this, no pressure, just something I thought would go well with the dress." Emily hesitated before opening it. When she did, she drew in a quiet breath. The bracelet shimmered delicately against the velvet lining. "It's beautiful," she said. "I wasn't sure what you liked," he admitted. "You chose well," she replied, fastening it around her wrist. "Thank you." They rode to the gala in silence, not the awkward kind, but the reflective sort that filled the space between two people aware of the precipice they were about to cross. Outside, the city glittered with holiday lights, couples in gowns and tuxedos, stepping from limousines, photographers ready to capture every arrival. The gala was more than a celebration. It was a parade of power, a place where appearance was currency, and Ethan Whitmore was expected to trade in it flawlessly. The car pulled up to the entrance of the Grand Hotel. Cameras flashed, and voices called out names. Ethan stepped out first, offering his hand to Emily. As she took it, she felt the eyes already beginning to turn. Inside, the ballroom was a spectacle of chandeliers, crystal glasses, and violins. Gilded columns rose to meet a painted ceiling, and everywhere people in tailored black and glimmering gold moved like they belonged. Emily followed Ethan's lead, her posture upright, her steps even. But the stares were impossible to ignore. Curious, calculating, some even openly appraising, she could hear the whispering begin before they were halfway across the room. Ethan leaned closer. "Ignore them," he said under his breath. "I'm trying," she answered. They moved through the crowd, pausing to greet a few of Ethan's acquaintances. The conversations were polite but stilted, the smiles slightly too wide. Emily offered nods, spoke when addressed, but she felt the divide like a physical barrier, the way eyes flicked down to her bracelet, the slight surprise when they learned her name. Still, she remained composed. She had spent years learning how to navigate spaces where she didn't quite fit, and tonight was no different, except that it mattered more. Later, during a brief lull in the music, Ethan turned to her. "Do you want to step outside for a bit? Get some air?" She nodded, grateful. They made their way toward the garden terrace, the chill of the evening brushing against her skin as they stepped out. For a few minutes, the world felt quieter. The lights from inside cast a warm glow through the glass, but out here, under the open sky, Emily finally allowed herself to exhale. "You're doing great," Ethan said, his voice low. She turned to look at him. "So far, no one's thrown me out." "They wouldn't dare," he said. She smiled, then looked away. "They might not need to. Some of them stare like I wandered in from the service entrance." Ethan's expression darkened. "They don't know you. They don't have to," she said. "I'm not here for them." He studied her face, saw the steadiness in her eyes. In that moment, he realized how much strength it took just to stand here, to face this crowd, to accept an invitation into a world that had never once offered her space before. And as the music resumed behind them, he understood that this night, which he had once considered a gesture of curiosity or rebellion, had already become something much more. The ballroom pulsed with orchestral elegance, every note of the waltz, drifting like perfume over the sea of silk gowns and bespoke tuxedos. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, their light casting soft golden hues across the walls lined with centuries-old oil paintings. Waiters in white gloves moved like synchronized dancers, balancing trays of champagne flutes that shimmered like starlight. It was in every way a sanctuary of elite tradition, a curated display of wealth masquerading as benevolence under the name of charity. And as the clock crept toward 7 o'clock, the entrances became more theatrical, each couple arriving, as though stepping into a stage play in which only the best costumes and pedigrees earned applause. Then came Ethan Whitmore. He had arrived at galas like this many times before, flanked by models, by actresses, by businesswomen with impressive credentials and even more impressive poise. But never had he arrived with someone like Emily Carter. And never had the reaction been so immediate, so palpable. When he stepped through the grand archway into the ballroom, with Emily beside him, the room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The collective pause in conversation, the half-turns, the measured glances, it all carried the same weight. Eyes swept over Emily like scanner beams, registering everything in an instant. Her dress, elegant but not designer. Her features, striking in their natural beauty. Her posture, confident but devoid of the effortless entitlement so common in this space. She did not look like them. That, it seemed, made her fascinating. Ethan, oblivious to none of this, kept his gaze forward, his expression composed. But his hand brushed lightly against the small of Emily's back, a gesture not of possession, but of reassurance. He knew what this moment meant, knew what it demanded of her. Emily walked with the kind of grace that couldn't be taught, a grace forged not in finishing schools, but in years of learning to move through the world unseen, undisturbed. Her eyes didn't dart, her shoulders didn't stiffen. She held her own center, even as whispers began to bloom like smoke around them. "Who is she?" a woman in emerald silk asked beneath her breath, loud enough to be overheard. "I heard she's his new assistant," replied another, hiding a smirk behind her champagne glass. "No, she's the help, like house staff." "That can't be right. Look at her bracelet, it's real. He wouldn't." He would, maybe it's a statement. A statement. That was how many framed it to themselves, as though Ethan's decision to bring Emily was a social experiment, a disruption calculated to provoke. But for Ethan, there had been no strategy behind it. Just a question, a moment of impulse, and a growing awareness that he respected her far more than he did anyone else in the room. They reached the edge of the dance floor where guests mingled between courses, and Ethan turned to her. "You holding up?" he asked, just above a whisper. "Yes," Emily said, her tone measured, "though I might need to pretend to drink. Something eventually." He smiled slightly, gesturing to a waiter. "2 club sodas," he ordered, deflecting the expectation of alcohol with the confidence of someone who could afford to do so. As she took her glass, Emily allowed herself a glance around the room. She saw men in tailored suits with clipped conversations, women with diamonds at their throats and tension in their laughter. But she also saw something else: curiosity, uncertainty, a shift. Her presence disrupted the narrative these galas thrived on, and for the first time she began to feel a sense of quiet power, not in the attention she drew, but in the way she refused to perform for it. Across the room, Madison Hale observed the scene with an expression of studied disinterest. Tall, blonde, and ruthlessly poised, Madison had been a regular fixture in Ethan's social life once upon a time. Their romantic entanglement had long since ended, but in events like these, the memory still lingered in subtle nods and shared glances. She watched Emily closely, cataloguing everything: dress cut, hairstyle, how she held her glass, how she responded to the questions of strangers. Madison's eyes narrowed, not in jealousy but in calculation. She recognized something dangerous in Emily's presence: authenticity. In a room full of curated lives, someone real was often the greatest threat. Soon, the music shifted into a slower rhythm. Couples began to pair off for a formal dance, the floor filling with synchronized movement. Ethan extended his hand to Emily, who hesitated only briefly before accepting. As they stepped onto the floor, the whispering grew softer, but the watching intensified. Neither spoke as they moved through the slow turns of the dance. Ethan's hand rested lightly on her waist, their steps aligning effortlessly. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw that despite everything, she was not overwhelmed. She was present. "You're not what they expected," he said quietly. "Neither are you," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. The music wrapped around them, a bubble of calm in the storm of gazes. They moved not like two people performing a role, but like two people navigating a current only they could feel. When the dance ended, they stepped aside. Applause followed, not for them but for the orchestra, and yet Ethan felt as if something had been acknowledged. Perhaps not publicly, perhaps not by name, but a shift had occurred. Later, while Ethan spoke briefly with the event organizers, Emily stood alone by the edge of the room. A man she didn't recognize approached her, older, with an expensive watch and a condescending tone. "You don't look like you're from around here," he said, chuckling at his own wit. Emily met his gaze without blinking. "I'm not." "What do you do?" "I work in private service," she replied. He nodded slowly. "Well, I suppose we all serve someone. Tonight at least you've got the best seat in the house." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was sharper than any retort. Ethan returned just in time to hear the tail end of the exchange. He didn't confront the man, but his jaw tightened as he guided Emily away from the circle of spectators. "I'm fine," she said before he could speak. "I know," he said, "but you shouldn't have to be." As the evening wore on, their bond, still undefined, still unspoken, deepened in small moments. A shared glance, a soft laugh. The quiet knowledge that this night had marked a turning point neither of them could yet name. And though the gala would end, and the city would return to its usual rhythm, something between them had shifted forever. Not with spectacle, but with truth. The ballroom's glow faded into a softer hum as the evening drew on. Dinner had been served, speeches made, donations pledged with champagne glasses raised high, and the string quartet now played more subdued melodies, their tempo aligned with the exhaustion of prolonged elegance. Yet amidst the subtle winding down, Ethan sensed something shift, not within the architecture of the event, but within the atmosphere surrounding Emily. She had managed the evening with quiet strength, navigating conversations that veiled curiosity, a civility, and enduring stares that lingered a heartbeat too long. But as the hours passed, Ethan began to notice small cracks in her composure, her smile faltering a touch more with each encounter, her gaze shifting more often toward exits and corners. She was still standing tall, still responding with grace, but the weight of the night had begun to settle on her shoulders. It was during a lull between dances that Madison Hale approached. The room seemed to part instinctively for her arrival, her gown shimmering like polished moonlight, her expression painted with amusement. She greeted Ethan first, her tone familiar, her eyes never quite leaving Emily. "Well, this is certainly different," Madison said, her voice smooth as silk and twice as sharp. "You've always had an eye for the unexpected, Ethan." Ethan offered a polite nod, his jaw set. "Good to see you, Madison." Madison turned to Emily, extending a hand. "You must be Emily. I've heard so much about you tonight. You've certainly made an impression." Emily took the hand, her grip neither cold nor warm but measured. "I'm sure people are saying many things." "Oh, they always do," Madison replied, laughing lightly. "But you're holding up beautifully. It must be enlightening, seeing all of this up close." Emily's eyes didn't flinch. "It's not the architecture that's surprising. It's the echoes." Madison's smile tightened, but she didn't miss a beat. "Very poetic. I like that." Ethan stepped slightly forward, his tone clipped. "Madison, if you'll excuse us." "Of course," she said, already turning. I'll let you two get back to whatever this is." They watched her retreat, her dress catching light as she moved through the crowd. For a moment, neither spoke. Emily finally broke the silence. "That was the kind of conversation that ends with you checking if your jewelry's still on your wrist." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, not quite looking at her. "She had no right." "She had every right," Emily replied, her voice low. "This is her world. I'm the one who stepped into it like an intruder." "You're not an intruder. That's not how it feels." They moved toward the terrace again, the same one they had stood on earlier. The night had deepened, the city lights stretching endlessly across the horizon. Emily leaned on the stone railing, the cool air brushing against her skin, offering a brief relief from the stifling warmth inside. "I thought I was ready for this," she said quietly. "You were," Ethan replied. "I'm not sure that's true." Ethan stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "I didn't invite you here to prove anything. I wanted you to see the world I live in. I thought maybe it wouldn't feel so far from yours." Emily turned to him, her expression unreadable. "But it is. It's light years away." He nodded slowly. "I'm starting to see that." "Why did you ask me, Ethan?" she asked, the question heavy with everything she had held back all night. "Was it because you were bored? Curious? Did you want to make a statement?" "No," he said more quickly than he meant to. "It wasn't about them. It was about you." Emily looked down, the city spinning beneath her. "I didn't come here expecting anything, but I didn't come here to be paraded either." "You weren't," he said firmly. She met his eyes. "Then what am I to you?" It was not a demand, but a truth she needed laid bare, and for a moment Ethan had no answer. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I wanted to find out." She breathed in slowly, the night air grounding her. "You're lucky. You can walk away from this room unchanged. I walk away with every whisper stuck to my skin." "I didn't see it," Ethan said, "not the way you're living it, but I'm seeing it now." They stood in silence, the distance between them suddenly, more visible than the skyline. And in that moment, the gala that had once seemed like a grand occasion now felt like a glass cage, beautiful but confining. Inside, the music swelled again, and the crowd resumed its endless cycle of social display. Ethan glanced back at the doorway, then at Emily. "I'll have the driver take you home whenever you're ready," he said gently. She nodded. "I think I'm ready now." They didn't walk back through the ballroom. Instead, Ethan led her through a side corridor, away from the lights and laughter, through a private exit that spilled into a quieter part of the hotel where their car waited. The driver opened the door without a word, and Emily paused before stepping in. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but distant. "For what?" "For not pretending it was easier than it was." And then she was gone, the car pulling into the stream of traffic, leaving Ethan standing on the curb under the soft glow of the entrance lights. He stayed there for a long while, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of a night that had exposed more than he'd expected. The discomfort he felt now wasn't from shame or regret, but from realization. For the first time in his life, Ethan Whitmore had stepped outside the illusion of his world, and what he found was not just judgment and complication, but a mirror reflecting back the hollowness of everything he once believed was control. The next morning came without the harsh jolt of alarm clocks or urgent calls. Instead, it arrived quietly, wrapped in the pale softness of an overcast sky that blanketed the city in a kind of muted forgiveness. Ethan sat in the corner of his expansive living room, coffee untouched, phone turned face down, suit jacket still draped over the back of the leather armchair from the night before. The silence in the penthouse felt heavier than usual, not peaceful but weighted, like the air after an argument that hadn't fully ended. He had barely slept. The gala, with all its grandiosity, had receded into the background of his thoughts. What lingered was the look in Emily's eyes as she stepped into the car, not angry, not accusing, but distant, removed, as if the experience had confirmed something she had suspected all along. He replayed the evening again and again, the whispers, Madison's veiled cruelty, the moment on the terrace where she had asked him the one question he couldn't answer. What am I to you? It haunted him not because he didn't know, but because he had never been asked to say it aloud. His life was not made of declarations. It was made of transactions, alignments, controlled interactions. But with Emily, nothing was calculated, and that terrified him. Across the city, in the Brooklyn apartment that felt both comforting and constricting, Emily sat by the window, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. Claire had already left for work, leaving behind a note on the fridge and a half-hearted promise to bring back pastries. The apartment was quiet, but Emily's thoughts were not. They spun in circles, flashes of chandeliers, Ethan's voice. In the dark, the way people had looked at her like a curiosity to be dissected. And yet under all the discomfort, there was something else. A lingering sense of clarity. She had seen the world Ethan lived in, not through the filtered lens of fiction or media, but with her own eyes. She had felt its chill, its beauty, and its quiet cruelty. And she had survived it. Dignity intact, no mask shattered, no tears shed. But something had changed. She hadn't expected Ethan to protect her, not really, but she had hoped he would understand, and perhaps he had too late. By late afternoon, the clouds had begun to clear, and the city pulsed with the quiet urgency of a Sunday recovering from itself. Ethan stood by the window of his study, watching the skyline in silence, until finally, without quite deciding to, he picked up his coat, left his phone on the desk, and walked out. He didn't call ahead. He didn't send a car. He simply took a taxi to Brooklyn and stood in front of Emily's building, feeling oddly unprepared. It wasn't the place that unsettled him. It was the uncertainty. He wasn't there to fix anything. He didn't have a plan. All he knew was that leaving things unsaid would mean losing something he didn't want to lose. Emily opened the door after 2 knocks, her expression unreadable, eyes steady. She wore a soft sweater and jeans, her hair down, no pretense of formality. She looked at him as though she had expected this, and yet had not entirely decided what she would do with it. "Can we talk?" he asked. She hesitated, then stepped aside. "The garden downstairs is open. We can sit there." They descended the narrow staircase and walked through the side exit that led to a small shared courtyard. It wasn't much. A few benches, some dormant rose bushes, a cracked fountain. But it was quiet and, more importantly, real. They sat on a bench beneath a bare tree, the cold air making their breath visible. "I'm not here to apologize for taking you to the gala," Ethan said after a moment, "but I am sorry for what happened there." Emily watched a bird flutter briefly to a nearby branch and then disappear again. "You don't owe me an apology for them. You didn't make them cruel." "No," Ethan agreed, "but I didn't stop it either." "You couldn't have," she said, her voice calm. "People like Madison don't need reasons to feel superior. They just need an audience." "I should have said something." "And what would that have changed?" she asked, not unkindly. "It's not your world that needs fixing. It's mine that I need to protect." He turned to her. "That's what I didn't see. I brought you into my world without asking if it was safe for you. I thought showing it to you would be generous, maybe even meaningful, but I didn't think about how it would feel to be seen as someone who didn't belong." Emily looked at him, really looked, and for the first time since that night, her expression softened. "You tried," she said. "That counts for something." "I didn't just bring you because I thought it would be interesting," he continued. "I brought you because I see you, because I respect you, because there's something about you I've never found in any of the people I'm supposed to admire." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, her fingers brushing the silver bracelet she had worn to the gala. It caught the light just faintly. "You listened to me that night," she said eventually. "On the terrace, you really listened. Most people ask questions so they can answer them themselves, but you didn't do that." "I'm still listening," he said. Emily drew in a long breath. "This doesn't mean I'm suddenly okay with that world. It doesn't mean I want to try and fit into it, but it does mean I'm willing to believe that maybe someone from that world can choose to be different." Ethan nodded slowly. "I don't know what this is between us. I won't pretend I do, but I know it's not casual, and it's not something I want to forget." The garden was still, the city muffled beyond its stone walls. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily stood. "Come upstairs," she said. It wasn't an invitation to something romantic, nor was it a gesture of forgiveness. It was simply a door opening, a space being made for honesty. And for Ethan, it was the first time in a very long time that he didn't feel like he was stepping into someone's life as a guest, but as a man willing to learn what it meant to be present. Inside that small Brooklyn apartment, they would share tea and perhaps not much more. But between them, the walls had shifted, not fallen, but moved just enough to see the person on the other side. And that was a beginning. The days following their conversation in the garden unfolded with the fragile rhythm of something new taking shape. Ethan returned to his routines, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The meetings still happened. Contracts were still signed, and the hum of commerce continued as always, but his focus wavered. He found himself checking his phone without purpose, rereading messages that hadn't changed, and looking out windows longer than usual, as if the skyline could somehow mirror his own inner recalibration. Emily had remained distant, but not dismissive. There had been tea, quiet conversation, the sense of something tentative and real. No declarations, no promises, just a space that hadn't existed before, something honest between them. But the world beyond their private truth had no interest in subtlety. It cared for spectacle, not substance, and spectacle came soon. The first sign appeared on a gossip blog, small, almost dismissible, a grainy photo of Ethan and Emily at the gala, captioned with loaded suggestion. "Whitmore's new flame? Real estate mogul brings mystery woman to charity ball." There was no malice at first, only curiosity. But curiosity, when fed to an audience desperate for contrast, soon mutates. Within 48 hours, it escalated. Other outlets picked it up. Speculation surged. The narrative twisted, from curiosity to condescension. "From maid to muse," one headline read, practically dripping with condescension, masked as intrigue. Another featured an anonymous quote, likely invented, claiming Emily had charmed her way into Whitmore's life and was playing a long game. The photos now spread faster, zoomed in on her expression, her dress, her posture, each analyzed like evidence in a trial no one had asked for. Ethan saw the headlines on a Wednesday morning as he sat in the back seat of his town car. His assistant, Nora, hesitated before bringing it to his attention. "It's picking up steam," she said carefully, "and some people, they're not being kind." He read in silence, jaw tight. The words didn't anger him. The cruelty did. The way strangers had made Emily a character, flattened, reinterpreted, devoured. "I want a statement," he said. "Something measured. Something that shuts this down." Nora nodded but paused. "Your PR team suggests we wait. It'll fade quicker if we don't respond." Ethan turned sharply toward her. "It's not about me." Later that day, as the buzz continued to grow, Ethan tried calling Emily. Once, twice. No answer. He sent a message, just a short line. "Call me when you can. I want to explain." But the reply never came, because by that afternoon Emily had seen everything. It started with a co-worker at the cafe down the block where she sometimes helped out on weekends. A friend texted her, not with concern, but with that morbid thrill people have when someone they know appears in gossip. "You're famous now," the message read, followed by a link. She clicked it, fingers trembling. And there it was, her name, her image, twisted into a story that bore no resemblance to reality. They called her ambitious, manipulative, calculated. One site even ran a side-by-side image of her at the gala and one from a local fundraiser she had attended in Brooklyn 2 years prior, suggesting a strategic rise. No one had asked her anything. No one cared for the truth. But what cut deepest wasn't the headlines, it was the silence. Ethan hadn't defended her, at least not publicly, not in the space where it mattered. He, who had the power to command attention with a sentence, had said nothing. She imagined the conversations in his world now, his board, his friends, the same people who had smiled at her in the ballroom. Were they advising him to lay low, to protect his brand? Was she now just an inconvenience? She didn't cry. She had cried for less before, but this was different. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. That evening, she packed a small bag and left Claire a note. She needed space, not to escape, but to breathe. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't be in her apartment waiting for a call that might never come. Ethan, meanwhile, was drafting statements. He was calling in favors, speaking to his lawyers, to the board, pushing against the tide of advisors who all told him the same thing. Distance yourself. Reframe the story, control the narrative. But he couldn't control this, because the narrative had already slipped through his fingers, and the only person who mattered wouldn't return his calls. By the next morning, social media had turned sharper. Hashtags trended. Comment sections swelled with opinion masquerading as morality. Emily's dignity was now a public forum. Every smile from the gala was dissected for signs of ambition. Every lack of designer label was chalked up to deception. People who had never met her wrote with the certainty of profits, and Ethan was silent still, not because he didn't care, but because every word he was advised to say felt like betrayal. The truth wouldn't fit in a press release. By Friday, Emily had turned off her phone completely. She stayed in a small room rented above a bakery run by an old friend of her mother's, someone who didn't own a television and didn't care for gossip. She worked in the mornings, helped in the kitchen. At night, she walked through quiet streets and remembered the peace of anonymity. She didn't hate Ethan, but she didn't trust him either. Not yet. Back in Manhattan, Ethan sat in his darkened living room, the silver bracelet he had once given her resting on the table before him. He turned it slowly in his fingers, over and over, a loop of metal and meaning that now felt like a question he could no longer answer. And across the city, Emily, sitting in a quiet room with the scent of warm bread in the air, wondered not if she had been wrong to say yes to that night, but whether Ethan had ever truly understood what he was asking her to walk into. The city had begun its subtle transition from winter to something softer. The snow had melted into dark lines along the curbs, and cold winds gave way to occasional hints of warmth that lingered between buildings like whispers. For Ethan Whitmore, the change in season passed unnoticed. The days bled into one another with an unfamiliar dullness, as though time had loosened its grip. No longer tethered to meetings or headlines or the tempo of success. He still showed up at work, still wore his suits, still responded to emails, but inside, something remained unanchored. His world, once precise, now felt slack at the edges. Weeks had passed since the night of the gala, since the fallout, since Emily had gone silent. Ethan had not tried again after the last message. He had not sent flowers, not made another statement. Something told him she didn't want grand gestures, that anything performative would only deepen the distance. He had seen her strength too clearly to believe she would be won over by apologies wrapped in gifts. So he waited. But the waiting wasn't passive. He found himself thinking about her constantly, not in the way one romanticizes a memory, but in the way one revisits a truth they hadn't fully grasped the first time. He remembered the way she studied a room before entering it, not to judge it, but to locate the exits. He remembered how she folded her hands when listening, never interrupting, always absorbing more than she let on. He remembered the weight behind her silences, not empty, but considered. Every detail of her, from the brush of her voice to the poise in her posture, returned to him in unguarded moments. In the quiet of his penthouse, which now felt far too large, he noticed things he hadn't before. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was hollow. The artwork on his walls, once a testament to taste and status, now felt impersonal. The expensive furniture, the polished wood, the curated lighting, it all lacked warmth. He saw the vacuum she had left behind, not in presence but in meaning. Ethan avoided the places they had shared. He didn't enter the study where she had once paused to look at the books. He avoided the garden terrace, which now seemed like a stage from which something honest had been pulled away too soon. And every time he walked past the guest bedroom, he remembered the night before the gala, when he had stood at the door holding the bracelet, unsure whether giving it would feel like a gift or a burden. He had not known then how delicate the line truly was. One evening, driven by something he couldn't explain, He went into the study and sat at the piano. It had been untouched for months, more decorative than functional. He opened the lid slowly, pressing a single key. The sound echoed faintly, rich and unfamiliar. He played a few tentative chords, his fingers clumsy. But the melody that came to him was soft and slow, shaped by memory, not music theory. He didn't know how to play well, but he played what he felt. The memory of Emily's voice returned then, not as sound but as sensation, the calmness it brought, the clarity. And he played until the notes dissolved into quiet again. Across the river, in a part of Brooklyn still untouched by gentrification's polish, Emily Carter walked the same path each morning before dawn. The streets were quiet, the city not yet awake. She liked the stillness. It allowed her to think without noise, to feel without defense. She had found comfort in the bakery's early hours, the rhythm of kneading dough, the scent of rising yeast. It was labor, but it was clean, direct, without pretension. She did not regret the gala, nor did she regret accepting Ethan's invitation. What she regretted was believing even briefly that his silence afterward had been a matter of strategy, that he had weighed her against public opinion and chosen the safer path. She hadn't heard from him since the last message, and though part of her had expected more, another part, deeper, quieter, respected that he had not pushed. Still, she thought of him, not in anger, but with that ache that comes when someone becomes part of your internal landscape, even in absence. She remembered the sound of his voice when he wasn't performing for anyone, the way he asked questions when he didn't already know the answers, the rare moments when he seemed like a man not just capable of care, but quietly starved for it. She often found herself touching the bracelet he had given her. She hadn't removed it, not out of sentimentality, but because it reminded her that, for one night, someone had seen her in a way she had long stopped expecting, not as a role, not as a story, but as a person. One afternoon, while cleaning out a storage closet at the bakery, she found an old box of her mother's things, photos, letters, a few keepsakes. Among them, a handwritten note she hadn't remembered keeping. It was dated years ago, written during a particularly difficult time. Her mother had written, "There will always be those who want to write your story for you. Let them talk, but never let them hold the pen." Emily held the paper in her hand for a long time. Later that night, she sat by the window in her rented room and watched the lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere beyond them, Ethan lived his life. She imagined him surrounded by glass and steel, by rooms curated to impress, and she wondered if he still thought of her. Ethan, at that same hour, sat in his penthouse, a stack of untouched documents before him, staring into the fire. The silence wasn't as loud as it had been. Now it simply waited. They were not speaking, but the memories spoke for them. And no matter how far apart they remained, those memories would not fade. It was a Thursday morning when Ethan Whitmore decided to stop listening to the voices that had shaped his life for decades. The board meetings, the PR advisors, the handlers and investors, all of them had offered the same counsel since the firestorm began: remain silent, wait for the public to forget, and protect the image. And he had tried. He had tried to follow the path of least resistance, to manage the storm without escalating it, to wait for the noise to die down on its own. But the noise hadn't faded. It had simply moved inward. For weeks now, he had lived in a state of quiet dissonance. His days were still structured, his calendar still full, but his sense of purpose had frayed. The world he had once controlled, with ease, now felt like it controlled him. And at the center of it all was the absence of someone who had, without intention, exposed the hollowness of that control. Emily hadn't just left his orbit. She had left a space where truth had once flickered, a space he hadn't known existed until it was empty. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the skyline of Manhattan stretching endlessly in front of him. It was a view most people would kill for, an empire built on vision and ambition, but for the first time, he saw it not as an achievement, but as a wall, a glass wall that separated him from everything that felt real. That morning, Ethan cancelled his meetings. He ignored the emails, turned off his phone, and left the building without a driver. He hailed a cab, something he hadn't done in years, and rode in silence across the bridge to Brooklyn. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't even know if she would see him. But he knew that continuing without trying would be the greatest cowardice of his life. The bakery was just opening when he arrived. The scent of yeast and sugar hung in the air, warm and inviting. Inside, he saw her through the window, her hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, a smear of flour on her wrist. She was speaking to the owner, an older woman with kind eyes, and smiling in a way he hadn't seen in weeks, a smile that belonged to no one but herself. He hesitated. For a long moment he stood on the sidewalk, the city moving around him, uncertain if his presence would bring resolution or disruption. But he hadn't come for closure. He had come to face what he had run from the moment the headlines began. Emily noticed him through the window. Their eyes met and the smile disappeared, not out of anger but something more complex. She wiped her hands on a towel, said something to the owner, and stepped outside. They stood facing each other in the cold morning air, the sounds of delivery trucks and early commuters a distant backdrop. "So you came," she said, her voice neutral. "I didn't know if I should," Ethan replied, "but I needed to." Emily crossed her arms, more for warmth than distance. "What are you here to say?" He didn't start with apologies. He didn't start with explanations. He started with the truth. "I've been living my life behind glass," he said, "and I didn't know it until you stepped through it." She said nothing, waiting. "I didn't speak out when I should have," he continued. "Not because I didn't want to, because I was afraid, not of them, but of doing it wrong, of making it worse for you." "It was already bad," she said. "I know, and I let you carry that alone. That was wrong." She looked away, the light catching in her hair. "I didn't need you to rescue me. I just needed to know I wasn't disposable." "You're not," Ethan said firmly. "You never were. But I was, raised in a world where people are measured by what they bring to the table. Status, leverage, influence. You walked in and didn't try to bring any of that, and still you brought more than anyone ever has." She looked back at him, eyes narrowed slightly. "So why didn't you say anything when it mattered?" "I thought I had to protect you by keeping you out of the spotlight," he said. "But I see now that silence didn't protect you. It erased you." Emily exhaled slowly. "And now I'm here," he said. "Not to fix it. Just to say I was wrong, and that I miss you. Not the idea of you. You." Her expression softened, but the wariness didn't disappear. "I've spent most of my life proving I belong in places that never wanted me, and I finally got to a place where I didn't need to prove anything. That night I forgot that, and it hurt more than I expected." "I didn't understand what I was asking of you," Ethan admitted. "But I do now." They stood in silence. The weight of weeks condensed into a single moment between breaths. Finally, she said, "I'm not ready to come back into your world. Not the way it is." "You don't have to," Ethan said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if you'd let me into yours." She studied him for a long time. Then, with a quiet strength that had nothing to prove, she said, "Come in, have some coffee." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a beginning. It was an opening. And for Ethan Whitmore, it was the hardest decision he had ever made. To walk away from control, from certainty, from the safety of silence and into the unknown. But as he stepped through the door of the bakery, following Emily into the soft light and the scent of bread and warmth, he realized it was the first decision that had ever felt like freedom. The interview had not been part of the plan. Ethan Whitmore hadn't scheduled it, hadn't prepared for it, and certainly hadn't run it past any of the multiple people paid to manage his image. But when the request came in, an informal sit-down for a charity initiative he had helped fund years ago, he said yes without hesitation. There was no PR script this time, no approved talking points, just a small studio, a camera, and a journalist who remembered when Ethan used to be more than a headline. He wore a charcoal blazer, no tie, and sat with a calmness that was new. Not the studied calm of corporate poise, but the stillness that comes when someone has stopped pretending. The lights were warm, the room quiet except for the occasional rustle of notes. And when the interview began, Ethan didn't speak like a CEO. He spoke like a man who had lost something and found something else in the process. The questions were simple at first, about the foundation's impact, recent projects, economic trends. He answered with ease, his voice steady. But then came the shift. "You've been in the news recently," the journalist said, not aggressively, but with curiosity. "There's been a lot of attention around your appearance at the Winter Gala and your guest." Ethan nodded once. "Yes, there has. Do you want to talk about that?" He could have dodged, could have smiled and redirected, but instead, he looked directly into the camera. "I think we live in a world where assumptions are currency," he said. "People see a photo, hear a name, and decide they know everything. They create stories from fragments. But what they don't see, what they often don't care to see, is the truth behind those stories." The journalist leaned in slightly. "What's the truth in this case?" "The truth," Ethan said, "is that I invited someone to that gala because I respected her. Because I wanted her to be part of something I thought mattered. And because I didn't realize how much of a risk that invitation really was. For her." He didn't say Emily's name. He didn't need to. "I failed her," he continued. "Not in bringing her, but in what came after. I thought silence was a form of protection. I thought ignoring the noise would keep her safe. But what I didn't understand was that silence can be its own form of violence." The room was silent. "I've spent years mastering silence," he said, "using it to navigate deals, deflect attention, keep people at a distance. But when it came to someone who deserved more than that, someone whose presence challenged everything I thought I understood about connection, I stayed silent. And that was a mistake." The journalist let the pause linger. "So what now?" Ethan took a breath. "Now I try to be different. Not louder, just clearer, more honest. I don't want to live in a world where dignity is determined by labels, or where love is seen as strategy. And I don't want to be the kind of man who lets others define what matters to him." The interview ended without drama. There were no sound bites tailored for virality. But when the video was released 2 days later, it resonated in ways no one expected. It wasn't his wealth or position that drew attention. It was the humility, the accountability. People didn't just share the video, they responded to it. Messages flooded in. Not all supportive, some still cynical, but many from people who had felt overlooked, judged, misrepresented. And among them, voices rose to defend Emily, not as a figure in Ethan's narrative, but as someone who had held her ground in the face of a storm she never asked to walk into. The tide began to turn, articles shifted tone, headlines changed. Where once they speculated on motives, now they examined the culture of assumption. Journalists began questioning why a woman's presence beside a powerful man sparked such invasive curiosity. Think pieces emerged on power dynamics, on media bias, on the quiet courage it takes to stand in a room that was never built for you and remain yourself. Emily watched the interview in the back room of the bakery, alone, the scent of flour and sugar filling the air around her. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, but something inside her shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something real. She watched as Ethan looked into the camera, not with performance, but with conviction. And she heard the words not as an audience, but as someone who had lived the silence he now rejected. Later that evening, her sister Claire walked in, holding her phone. "You've seen it, right?" Emily nodded. "He didn't have to do that," Claire said, leaning against the counter. "No," Emily replied, "but he did." Across the city, Ethan returned home to an inbox filled with noise. But this time, it wasn't noise he needed to silence. It was proof that truth still had a place in the world, that dignity once lost could be honored again, not by reclaiming it, but by acknowledging the ways it had been overlooked. He didn't know if Emily would reach out. He didn't expect her to. But in speaking the truth, openly, without filter, he had finally said the thing that mattered most. Not "I love you," not "I'm sorry," but "I see you." And for the first time, the world saw her too. Spring had begun to unfurl itself across the city slowly and stubbornly, as if unsure whether it was safe to return. The streets of Brooklyn were speckled with early blooms, pink and white, and defiant against the remaining chill. Park benches no longer sat empty. Children returned to playgrounds. Cafes cracked open their sidewalk seating, and with the thawing air came a softness in people's faces, a hint of optimism creeping back into the corners of daily life. Emily Carter had found a rhythm again, though different from the one she had known before. Her mornings were still filled with the scent of fresh dough and rising bread, her hands busy from dawn to midday, but her evenings had changed. She spent them walking, sometimes with Claire, sometimes alone, moving slowly through streets she had known all her life, rediscovering them as if seeing them with new eyes. Not because the streets had changed, but because she had. The bakery owner had offered her a more permanent position, and she had accepted. There was something deeply satisfying in the simplicity of honest work, something grounding about being needed not for appearances, but for presence, for skill, for consistency, for who she was without makeup, without armor. Still, the quiet wasn't always easy. There were nights she would sit by the window and feel the echo of what had passed. Not regret, not longing, but the shape of something, unfinished. And then, one evening in late April, the community center where she had once volunteered held a fundraising event. Not a gala, nothing grand or exclusive. Just a gathering of locals, teachers, volunteers, kids and their families. There were folding chairs, homemade desserts, paper banners. And for the first time in months, Emily felt like she could show up somewhere without being observed like a symbol. She wore jeans and a navy blue blouse, her hair tied back loosely, and helped set up tables and distribute flyers. The warmth of the room was real, the kind built from shared purpose rather than shared status. Laughter was easy, not filtered. No one asked what she did for a living with a smirk. No one recognized her from the news. It was a night of small talk and real smiles, until she saw him. He was standing near the back, just inside the door, hands tucked into the pockets of a grey coat. He wasn't trying to be noticed. In fact, he seemed hesitant to step further inside, as if he too wasn't sure whether he belonged. Ethan Whitmore looked nothing like the man who had once strode into charity balls like he owned them. He looked like someone who had learned the value of stillness, someone who had chosen to walk into a space not for show but because it mattered. Emily froze, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of recognition. The last time she had seen him, it had been on a sidewalk outside. The bakery, their words cautious, raw. Since then, she had watched his interview, read the articles, seen the tide turn. But none of it had changed her as much as this simple truth. He was here, now, without an audience. He noticed her across the room and didn't smile, didn't wave. He waited, and when she finally moved toward him, the room faded just a little. "Hey," he said when she was close enough to hear. "Hey," she replied, her voice steady. "I didn't come to make a scene," he said quickly. "I just heard you were helping with this. Thought maybe I'd contribute, quietly." Her eyes searched his face. He looked tired but clear. Not like a man trying to win her back, like a man showing up because he no longer knew how not to. "They could use some help at the auction table," she said after a moment. "You any good with ticket stubs? I'm a fast learner." They worked side by side for over an hour. No deep talk, no big moments, just the slow comfort of shared space. They handed out forms, explained raffle rules, poured punch. And somewhere between counting change and laughing over a mislabeled prize basket, Emily realized something unexpected. She wasn't bracing anymore. She wasn't waiting for him to say something clever or profound. She wasn't holding back. Emotion like a dam. She was just being. Later, as the event wound down, Ethan stepped outside for air and she followed. The evening was crisp, the sky clear. "I didn't know if you'd ever want to see me again," he said. "I didn't either," she answered. "But you're here. So are you." A quiet passed between them, not heavy, just full. "I saw your interview," she said finally. "I heard what you said. I meant it all." "I know." They stood in silence again, the kind that held something sacred. "I'm not the same man you met," he said. "I don't move in those circles the same way. I've stepped back from a lot, lost a few clients, some friends, and I don't regret it." Emily looked out over the street. "I'm not the same woman either," he turned to her. "I didn't want you to be." She met his eyes. "Then why are you here?" Ethan took a moment. "Because I realized I don't need to ask you to come into my world. I need to ask if I can walk with you in yours." It wasn't a line, it wasn't polished, but it was real. Emily considered him. This man who had once offered her a night of spectacle, now offering something quieter, something far more valuable. She didn't give him an answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for his hand, and in that small, simple gesture, the reunion wasn't loud. It wasn't romantic in the storybook sense, but it was honest. And in the honesty, something beautiful began again. Not a return, but a continuation. Not a second chance, but a new beginning. Together, they walked back inside, side by side. And this time, they weren't stepping into a ballroom. They were stepping into something real. There was no grand announcement, no headline, no sudden wave of social media posts documenting the return of Ethan Whitmore and Emily Carter. What happened between them after that quiet reunion at the community center didn't belong to the world that had once tried to dissect their story. It belonged to them alone. It began not with declarations, but with rhythms, unassuming, slow, and deeply intentional. In the weeks that followed, Ethan became a more regular presence in Brooklyn, not as a spectacle, not as an outsider trying to adapt, but as a man learning to live without a mask. He showed up at the bakery sometimes, not to be noticed, but to help. At first, it was the simplest tasks: unloading deliveries, carrying flour, sacks sweeping up after close. He asked questions instead of offering suggestions. He followed rather than led. He made mistakes and laughed at himself. Emily, ever watchful, allowed space for this version of him to unfold without pressure. She didn't test him or demand consistency. She simply observed. What she saw wasn't a man performing goodness, but one who was slowly, and perhaps for the first time, choosing to be present in the smallest details of a shared life. He learned the names of the other staff, helped a local kid with math homework in the back room, even volunteered to read during story time at the neighborhood library when no one else could. He had changed, not completely, not without moments of struggle, but enough that the edges of his old life no longer fit as easily. He sold off one of his penthouses. He stepped down from 2 corporate boards. He redirected a portion of his wealth into community programs, not because it looked good, but because it felt right. For the first time, his decisions were no longer based on return, but on meaning. And Emily, she didn't return to the woman she had been before the gala. That version of her no longer existed. Instead, she embraced a self she had spent years building beneath the surface, independent, principled, and quietly strong. She continued working, but also took up new challenges. She started a reading program for young girls in the neighborhood, focusing on confidence and expression. She mentored local teens through college application processes. Her life remained rooted in humility, but it blossomed outward in purpose. Their relationship grew not in dramatic moments, but in the subtle weaving of lives. They took walks together on quiet evenings, discussed books over coffee, disagreed openly and respectfully, and learned to be vulnerable without fear. There was no rush to define what they were, because what they were becoming mattered more. One afternoon, several months after their reunion, they found themselves sitting on a bench at Prospect Park. The air was warm, the light soft with the promise of early summer. Children played nearby, their laughter rising in waves. A dog barked in the distance. The city, for once, felt peaceful. "I used to think love meant sacrificing who you are for someone else," Emily said, watching a little girl chase a kite across the grass. Ethan glanced at her, thoughtful. "And now?" "Now I think love is about being more yourself with someone than you ever dared to be alone." He nodded, quiet. "You make me more honest. Not because you ask it of me, because I want to be." They sat in silence for a moment longer. "You ever think about that night?" he asked. "The gala?" He nodded. "I do," she said. "But not with regret. I think it showed us both, who we were and who we weren't yet. And who we could be," he added. She looked at him. "And who we're still becoming." There was no ring in his pocket, No orchestrated proposal, no string quartet waiting in the bushes. Just two people who had walked through something difficult, stumbled more than once, and chosen again and again not to give up. That evening, back at Emily's apartment, Claire joined them for dinner. The three of them sat at the small kitchen table, candles flickering, laughter spilling freely. They ate simple food, roasted vegetables, lemon chicken, a pie from the bakery, and talked about everything and nothing. When Claire excused herself to take a call, Ethan and Emily lingered at the table. "This," he said, motioning to the scene. "This is what I never knew I needed." Emily smiled. "It's not what you had before." "No, and I hope it never is." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. No performance, no fear. They didn't need a label. They didn't need permission. They had built something rooted in truth, not tradition. It was a kind of love that didn't rush toward the finish line. It unfolded moment by moment, through respect, resilience, and choice. Eventually, they did move in together, into a modest place in Brooklyn, closer to the bakery than any boardroom. It wasn't about downsizing. It was about choosing a life. That matched who they had become. The world, as always, moved on. New scandals arose, new faces captured attention. The media stopped asking questions. The spotlight shifted elsewhere. But in the quiet of their shared mornings, in the hum of coffee brewing, in the comfort of overlapping routines and late-night conversations, Ethan and Emily found a rhythm that was theirs alone. And the night of the gala, what had once seemed like a fairy tale or a social statement, became just the beginning of something far less glamorous, but infinitely more meaningful. A new beginning, not perfect, but real. And for them, that was everything.